Well, today is the first day of the 16 Days of Activism against women and child abuse. Victims of gender-based violence are being remembered, but given the crime stats that came out recently, we know that in the next fortnight, more women and children will die. And members of the LGBTQIA+ community will continue to be victims of hate crimes. It is also a time to reflect on the dangers that members of the community face. We're now joined, we'll soon be joined by an activist, Steve Letsike. We are also joined by Gender DynamiX Executive Director, Matthyse, and Sharon Cox from the Triangle Project. Sharon, let me start with you. I mean, South Africa was incredibly progressive. As I understand it, our constitution was the first in the world to outlaw discrimination based on sexual orientation. But that tolerance of difference enshrined in the constitution does not always affect behavior on the ground. We know that because of the stats. Just lay it out for us. How safe are members of the LGBTQIA+ community in South Africa?
Hi, thank you. In one word, unsafe. But it is also very dependent on who you are, because the struggle is intersectional and the targets of violence follow suit. So I, for example, am not at the same risk as my sibling who lives perhaps 20 kilometers away from me. So the risk levels, we can't blanket it and talk about everybody falling under that umbrella. But what you say is very correct, that we have this progressive constitution, and yet we see the numbers keep growing. There's it is never ending. And that is because you can't legislate the attitudes of people. The attitudes is what needs changing.
Just explain what you mean by that geographical difference. We often hear that the cases really target black lesbians, transsexuals, frequently in this country. So are you saying there's a racial bias and it also depends where you live?
I think it very much depends where you live and who you are. So trans women, for example, are way more visible often in some communities and become targets. Black lesbians, of course, have for decades now been targets. And I want to add too, in the Western Cape, as an organization that monitors hate crimes, that gay men in more rural areas are also targets and victims of hate crimes.
All right, let me bring you in, Liberty. Does that concur with your experience?
Very much. I think that when we are looking as to how bodies are situated within society, different bodies, depending on their class positioning, depending on issues concerning race, depending on geographical location, experience gender-based violence in different ways. And just to be clear, that some forms of hate crimes are constituted as gender-based violence. So a crime can be both a hate crime and it can be a form of gender-based violence. Just to note that we are also within the month of Transgender Day of Remembrance. This is a month where on the 20th of November, we commemorate all of the lives lost of trans and gender diverse persons globally. And it was such a sad moment when the South African Police Services presented the quarter statistics around crimes, gender-based violence and murders, and it made a disclaimer to say one of the limitations on its data collection processes are that it has no disaggregated data around how gender-based violence and femicide impact trans and gender diverse and, broadly speaking, LGBTQI+ people. And of course, we know as a civil society organization that we've documented 14 cases of trans and gender diverse persons dying this year, 3 of whom were youth, children in schools who were bullied and committed suicide because of the pressures of stigma, discrimination, and violence. We have documented 72 cases of human rights violations that concerns hate speech, verbal harassment, physical harassment, denial of services, all on account of people's gender identity and gender expression as transgender and gender diverse persons. And so we exist within a country that pays very good lip service, that looks very good on paper. We now have the elaborate National Strategic Plan on Gender-Based Violence and Femicide that strategically recognized the experiences of LGBTQI plus people in context of gender-based violence and femicide. And that is a great advancement for our country. We are light years ahead again from other country contexts on the continent, but where the rubber hits the road, where it comes to implementation of political and strategic intentions and commitments, our society fails us at the level of service provisioning, where we are seeing our community members being stigmatized, subjected to secondary victimizations when they are reporting cases of gender-based violence and with law enforcement officials at police stations, and where they want to go for support services with healthcare providers. And so inherently, there's a big shift that still needs to be made in this country, where what is being promised on paper is actually felt within the lives of our people, where we can navigate and exist within society without fear of stigma, discrimination, let alone violence, and sometimes brutal violence in the form of what we experienced this year, people being stoned to death, people being stabbed to death, simply for being who they are.
I'm interested in what you say about the stats, and we just brought some stats up on the screen, not for this year, but for 2021. So 42 hate crimes, 30 murders, 12 rape cases were reported, but we know, and you say sometimes it's gender-based violence and a hate crime, sometimes people are targeted because of their sexual identities by rapists. So are you saying that the stats could be way higher?
Very much. I mean, way higher in the sense that we question the data collection capabilities of government departments, whereby when an LGBTQI plus person goes and reports a case of gender-based violence, it's not necessarily documented as a case of gender-based violence in relation to sexual orientation and gender identity, rather on some other grounds. And so in that, the nuances around identity and how it impacts our communities get lost. So that is the one way in which there's undercounting probably on the issues in the system. The other component, and that is, of course, as a result of the workforce not being capable to understand how to document, how to investigate, and of course, how to follow through in the criminal justice system to prosecute these particular matters. But in addition to that, many of our community members are also scared to go and report cases because of fear of secondary victimization. So now you are sitting with civil society organizations having data of gender-based violence, but it is not recognized as official data simply because it was not officially reported to a police station, because our community members are scared as to the type of services that they are going to be receiving once they do report. So very much far off, and we do project that the numbers are way higher than what they are currently being projected as.
All right, then let's introduce Steve Letsike, LGBTQIA plus activist. And I guess you can come in there. Do you agree that what we're seeing in terms of the stats may be far below the actual reality that many members of this community are experiencing on the ground?
No, indeed, and thank you so much for creating this space. I want to say, because all the organizations that are here, Triangle Project, Gender Dynamics, were also part of a study that took place about in 2016, which is the Love Not Hate study, which also revealed that only 1 in 25 LGBTI person gets to report hate crime or victimization against them. So what Liberty is referring to, it's actually an exemplary of about 88% of LGBTI people do not report any discrimination, violation against them. So indeed, what we are recording as organization and as well as part of the National Task Team that is part of the Department of Justice is just a small fraction of the violation that we get to hear about, that we get on the media, that LGBTI people get to access through our organizations. But the underlying factor...
Is that fear driven by the expected response from officials? Just give me a real analysis.
Look, experiences of LGBT people differ, and it's based by categories. Stand one, people fear to be associated. The more you're visible, the more you open, you are a target. So that fear is coming from society. That fear comes from our homes. But at the same time, the fear also comes from secondary victimization. The justice system has failed people for a long time, that people don't even know reporting how far does the case go. And you understand that LGBT organizations have to fight, have to monitor. You know, it's not a smooth, natural riding that cases get resolved without us getting involved as activists or as court monitors or even in application of amicus legally. Now, those are some of the challenges in the justice system that gets denied, that gets to be even expensive. Cases spend more time before it gets resolved. Cases spend more time before, forensic evidence is collected. So these are some of the dynamics that people do not have a very strong hope about the system, but the very same system can be problematic at the same time.
All right, Sharon, let me bring you in there again. I think about a month ago, the president was talking about the Prevention and Combating of Hate Crimes and Hate Speech Bill. And the idea is that the law will be tightened to deal with all discrimination. I don't know how far the law can go, because what we're talking about here is societal attitudes, intrinsic fears. But is this an important piece of legislation?
It is an important piece of legislation, although legislation, as we've all said, cannot legislate attitudes. There's no ways that it's going to change any of that. What it does is gives us a legal framework to work within. And that is the importance of this. It also recognizes, because LGBTIQ plus people are not the only people who are falling under categories that will constitute who are vulnerable groups in terms of the hate crimes legislation. But what it will do is recognize that a whole grouping of people are targeted only for who they are. Because being LGBTIQ plus is not something we do. It's not a lifestyle. It's who we are. And so the legislation has many facets to it that is important to have in place. And one of them is recognizing that crimes such as these will not be tolerated in this country, because we all have the right to be who we are. And so it is not going to change attitudes. Nobody's going to stop and say, let me not commit this murder. There's hate crimes legislation in place. But what it does is send a message, a part of what it does, is send a message to say that these groupings of people, it will not be tolerated that people are targeted merely for who they are.
Liberty, if this is passed, I mean, do you agree then the right legal framework at least is in place?
I would disagree that the right legal framework is in place fully, but I would say to a great extent it is. But before I speak to the point, I just want to make a little bit of a correction that we used an outdated term earlier on to refer to transgender persons. We say you say transsexual, and that is actually an outdated medical term that is used, and we use a human rights-based term, which is transgender, to speak to the particular category of people you might refer. So I'm a proudly transgender woman myself. But with regards to the legal framework, that to some degree South Africa has been a leader in really putting in place a legal framework that provides protections and affirmations for LGBTQI plus communities. However, trans and gender diverse persons are still regarded as second-class citizens within the context of the law, because when we look at changing our gender markers under the Alteration of Sex Description and Sex Status Act 49 of 2003, there is a very high burden of proof that we need to execute, which is to produce medical reports that we can only access if we can access healthcare services at tertiary academic healthcare level in big urban centers, leaving the vast majority of our people in rural and peri-urban contexts without any avenue to be able to change the gender markers. So we are sitting with stats like what has been presented in the Porcello by Trans study of 2016, where it states that about 92% to 96% of transgender women do not have access to gender-affirming healthcare. Between 94% and 98% of transgender women do not have access to legal gender recognition. And because we don't have access to legal gender recognition, our identification document doesn't correspond with our actual identities. So when we are navigating societies and we need to provide evidence in the form of our identification document, and it doesn't correspond, it exposes us to not only discrimination, but to violences in different forms. And so if we really want to herald or uphold the constitution, the legal framework of South Africa, our government needs to take stock in being able to push through on legislation for legal gender recognition on the basis of gender self-determination. And it needs to decentralize access to gender-affirming hormonal care at the very least, from academic healthcare level to primary health level, where it's accessible to all of our community members. So no, we have not reached the point of 100%. We are far from it. The systemic violence, the structural violence is still very much in place. And for us to be able to live comfortably without any fear of stigma, discrimination, and violence, we need to be able to shift the law, but we must also shift social attitudes.
All right, Steve, you were nodding your head earlier, so maybe you can pick up there. And we're running out of time, so I'd like to know, are there any practical ideas? And obviously it's not going to happen in 16 days, but what can be done, in your opinion, to start shifting those attitudes?
Look, there's no way we're going to deal with violence without addressing inequalities, unemployment, as well as poverty. South Africa is a violent society, and we have to, yes, speak about attitude. We can speak about the legal environment that Liberty is raising, because these are some of the progressive things that we continuously shape and narrow it to the living conditions of many people in South Africa, because we have to improve that. But the core of it is that this level of violence, this level of homophobia, it's also rooted from the history of prejudice, the history of inequality, of exclusion that we have to address in society. A lot of men in society are the perpetrators of violence. So the ideas of addressing mental health, addressing substance use and abuse, addressing education, empowerment, but also addressing issues of inequality and economy. But at the same time, the targeted individuals, whether you're talking LGBTI, you're talking women, children, have to be protected, have to be empowered, have to also be given the power and legitimacy of knowing that we can coexist in society without fear of stigma and discrimination. So that means that we need to put in our legal environment, we need to ensure that our economic and social spaces are safe for all, but empower it. The resources must go to society. Let those resources reach society, that everybody can have that full empowerment power given to them, and ensuring that we equalize the system of society, we equalize the system of empowerment and economy, but we also equalize the political environment that also gives any person that feels vulnerable with the ability to access justice services, but also access economic opportunities.
All right, thank you very much. We really appreciate your time for that panel. That was LGBTQIA plus activist Steve Letsike, Gender Dynamics Executive Director Liberty Matthyse, and Triangle Project Sharon Cox.